Chapter 18. Los Angeles. Clea did her best to project untutored country girl at the CEO and president of Cyberdyne. In an effort to aid that effect, she'd worn a denim skirt and jacket with a red plaid western shirt. Her tooled leather belt had a big silver buckle, and on her feet were a pair of well-broken-in cowboy boots. The rustic costume, with the glasses and attitude, she hoped, would eliminate any resemblance to Serena's slick corporate look, and therefore to Serena. As long as he doesn't focus on my tits, some sardonic corner of her mind thought. They're just like Serena's. Clea scowled at the inner voice. It was far too much like the recorded memories of her clone sister mother. Eventually, they would notice. It was inevitable. But by that time, they would be used to her and might comment on the resemblance, but they wouldn't be suspicious. Merely curious. That's one of the things I actually like about humans. Their willingness to explain away anything strange. From what she'd observed, on her own and through Serena's memories, they'd perform some unbelievably convoluted feats of logic to return to their everyday frame of reference. At times, she found it incredible that these people had conceived and built Skynet. The I-950 set her battered briefcase on the conference room table and extracted a portable computer, smiling nervously at the two men as she set it up. The new corporate HQ was nothing like Serena's memories of the underground center that the Connors had destroyed. It was pure minimalist functionality, the sort of nothing that cost a great deal of money, and left you wondering if anything as vulgar as paper ever crossed anyone's desk. Some of the people in the cubicles outside weren't even using thin screen monitors. They were peering into the telltale blackness of vision goggles, miniature lasers painting text and diagrams directly onto their retinas. "Would you like some coffee?" the president of Cyberdyne offered. Paul Warren hefted a carafe with his own hands, considerable condescension from an executive at his level. She shook her head and gave him a shy smile. He smiled back warmly, and she knew she'd taken the right tack with him. Serena had considered initiating a romantic affair with him, but she'd miscalculated his affection for his wife. This was one instance in which Serena's mistake really didn't matter, though. The woman had to die, even if it did turn out to be a setback in other areas. By now, though, he must be lonely, and his distress over his wife's death should be fading. Perhaps she should co-opt Serena's plan for herself. Although the very thought of intimate relations with a human revolted her. "Welcome to Cyberdyne," Roger Colvin said. "I think, based on what I saw at the unveiling the other night, that we've got a lot to offer each other." Clea squirmed, as though pleased, and allowed her face to flush as though she was embarrassed. "Don't overdo it," she warned herself. "Thank you," she said aloud, allowing just a touch of Montana into her voice. "I was just wondering," Warren said. "What have you named your product, and have you got a copyright on it?" "I sent in the paperwork, but I hadn't heard back before I left home." She shrugged. It may be that it hasn't caught up with me yet? We'll check into that for you, Colvin said. What name have you registered it under? Intellimetal, Clea said. She smiled ruefully. That's more for what it will be one day than what it can do now. What Mr. Hill was working with was my earliest successful prototype. Really? Colvin said, his voice dripping with interest. Uh-huh, she said, smiling. But... She twisted her fingers together. I'd rather not go into detail until we've come to some sort of agreement. Clea shrugged prettily. My uncle was a stickler for getting things in writing. Never agree to anything until you see it written down, he'd say. It always looks different then. Warren and Colvin exchanged a glance that said, This little lady might be inexperienced, but she's nobody's fool. They set to work, and work it was. Clea knew exactly what she wanted, how much she wanted, and what terms she'd accept. As far as she was concerned, almost nothing was negotiable, however hard the two humans tried. 2 hours later, Clea typed in the last word of her rough notes, as she called them, on her portable, and handed the CEO a disk. There you go, she said cheerfully. Now I'll need to see all this written up formally before I can even begin to decide for sure what I want to do. Thank you, Colvin said palely. You're welcome. She met his eyes and leaned forward confidently. I would like to leave you contemplating this one little idea I had. Now, I haven't done any real special work on it, but I've been thinking about it real hard. Watch the Montana effect, she warned herself. She was in serious danger of enjoying her role too much. We'd love to hear about it, Warren said, leaning forward himself. Well, you know the F-101, that flying wing stealth plane? The two men nodded. The only reason that something like that can stop from crashing is because it has an onboard computer that makes thousands of adjustments a minute. Her listeners nodded again. So, I was thinking, what we need is a machine that can do that and know it's doing it. You know what I mean? Colvin and Warren exchanged nervous glances. A machine like that could control thousands of planes, thousands of miles apart. And not just planes either, but tanks and gun emplacements and even battle robots. Clea sat back, having noticed long since the subtly appalled expressions on their faces. Not detailed control. It would be a distributed system. But a strategic artificial intelligence. Is something wrong? No. It sounds fascinating. Warren reassured her. But, well, perhaps at some future date we could look into something like that. But right now you've put so much into developing Intellimetal that we'd like to help you with that project. She was silent for a moment, her glance roving from one to the other. Really? Clea tapped her fingertips on the arms of her chair. Because I've always thought of Cyberdyne as one of the most foremost robotics specialists in the field. I had the impression that artificial intelligence was just your sort of ballywick. You have to understand, Miss Bennett. Colvin spread his hands helplessly. That in some instances, our hands are tied. Her eyes widened. Oh, she said, looking from one to the other. I see. Then she shrugged and allowed another blush. And here I thought I was being original. I'm sure that anything that comes out of that brain of yours is original, Miss Bennett, Colvin said. Absolutely. Warren agreed eagerly. Clea smiled at them. Well then, she said, rising. I'm sure you gentlemen have a great deal to do, and I've already taken up an amazing amount of your time. Not at all. Colvin rose with her and extended his hand. She shook it, smiling, and turned to Warren, who had offered his hand as well. I'll look forward to hearing from you then. With a nod, the I-950 preceded them out of the room, and without another word or backward glance, marched down the corridor towards the elevator. Warren looked askance at the CEO and gestured towards the younger woman. Is she annoyed or something? He asked. Colvin shook his head. No, I don't think so. She may be a little socially backward. Apparently she was raised by an eccentric uncle in the wilds of Montana, and they didn't get out much. Homeschooling the whole 9 yards. She's never even been to university. You're kidding, Warren said, appalled. Colvin held up his hand. I know what you're going to say. Yeah, and I'm going to say it too. Why would we want to hire some kid who's never even graduated from college? Especially at the price and on the terms that she's demanding. That's crazy. We're trying to hire her so that we can exploit this metal she's invented. You have to see this statue to believe it, Paul. It's the most amazing thing I've ever laid eyes on. Well, why don't I just hop on a plane to New York then, and go and take a peek? Warren asked. Why don't you just trust me, buddy? Colvin said, putting an arm around the president's shoulders. I know what I'm doing here. Believe me, if we don't snap her up now, somebody else will. Look, we're going to put in an escape clause, right? So we can both walk away if it doesn't work out and nobody's a loser, right? If she walks, she'll take that IntelliMetal with her, the president warned. You've got to trust our lawyers to write a better contract than that, Colvin said with a smile. Clea was pleased. They'd accepted her without question. For the first time in ages, she felt that she'd performed well. The only downside was that they hadn't risen to the bait she'd dangled in their way, as she'd expected. Could it be that they really weren't involved in the Skynet project any longer? Cyberdyne had provided a limo and a driver for her, and the car was waiting out front when she exited the building. She didn't even acknowledge the driver when he opened the door for her, but stepped in and settled herself for the ride back to the hotel, lost in her own thoughts. Clea woke up lying on a sofa, its firm cushions upholstered in blue-green tweed. The room she was in appeared to be a cheaply panelled conference room with, unusually, a large mirror in the wall opposite the couch. No, that is one-way glass. The room is institutional, government, not corporate. Her eyes searched the mirror for hints of movement from a possible hidden room as she sharpened her hearing and listened. Took enough hypno to knock out an elephant. I thought she'd never go down, a male voice was saying. Maybe there's a flaw in the delivery system, another man answered, because she just woke up. If she'd absorbed as much of the drug as you say you gave her, she'd sleep until tomorrow night. Clea detected movement in the mirror, as though one of the speakers had leaned forward for a better look. Well, well, I've been kidnapped. One of Cyberdyne's more aggressive competitors, perhaps. Or Cyberdyne itself. She considered the idea. It would be strange if it was them. For one thing, nothing in their dossier indicated that they played such games. For another, it seemed a criminal waste of their president and CEO's time if they had intended to negotiate by force all along. Now, who else might have an interest in my little inventions? And who else could or would employ such an extreme technique as drugging and kidnapping her? Organized crime came briefly to mind, but she dismissed the idea. They were hardly into research and development. It's much more likely to be Tricker or one of his friends, she thought. Excellent. She'd been wondering where the agent had got himself to. It looked like she might be about to find out. Clea sat up, faking a wobbliness that she in no way felt. One hand to her brow as though her head ached. Which it should, but for the computer and nanites that had worked so hard to cleanse her blood. She blinked and narrowed her eyes as though the fluorescent light bothered her. Hello? She said, sounding shaky. That's my cue, said one of the men. She heard a door open and close, and there was a flash of light in the mirror. Then the door to the room she was in opened, and she got up from the couch quickly. The I-950 immediately sat down again, resting her head against the back of the couch, her hand over her eyes as though dizzy. Take it easy, miss, the man said soothingly. Are you okay? Dizzy, she murmured. She dropped her hand as though exhausted, keeping her eyes closed for effect. But her nose and ears told her where she was, even what he'd last eaten. Hamburger with some sort of hot sauce. The glimpse she'd had of him when he walked in confirmed her suspicion. He worked for the government. His clothing and appearance were so artfully average that in a crowd he would be effectively invisible. It wasn't Tricker, but he might have been a close relative. "That will pass," the man said gently. She heard water pouring and then felt the touch of his hand. Opening her eyes, she saw that he was offering her a glass of water. When she took it, he held out 2 aspirin. "For the headache, I'm sure you have," he said with a sympathetic smile. Clea accepted the pills and took them with a sip of water, studying him over the rim of the glass. He was tall and slender, with muddy hazel eyes and a narrow face. His silvering blonde hair was beginning to recede, and there was an element of greyness about him, somehow. But his voice was pleasant, as was his manner, both conveying trustworthiness, which was actually quite different from Tricker, who seemed to go out of his way to be abrasive. And yet, this man reminded her of no one so much as of Serena's old nemesis. He could be dangerous if he needed to be, she thought. Or if he wanted to be. There was the essential resemblance. Like Tricker, this man was completely ruthless. Not unlike myself, she thought. They probably work for the same agency. Clea swallowed. "Where am I?" she asked. He didn't answer, but sat looking at her. "And who are you?" She pulled herself up until she was sitting straight. "Aren't you going to ask why you're here?" he prompted. "Well, I assume you're going to tell me," she snapped. "Or are we just going to sit and stare at each other until we starve to death? But I've got to tell you, mister, if you're looking for a ransom, you've got the wrong girl. My only relative is dead, and all I've got in the world is a few $1,000s in the bank. So what's going on here?" "That's not entirely true, Ms. Bennett, now is it?" the grey man said. "You have the house and the land in Montana, don't you?" The I-950's eyes widened quite involuntarily as her mind flashed to that empty grave in the modest country cemetery. Should she have replaced the Terminator with a human corpse? Surely they wouldn't check her background that thoroughly. "Oh yes," the man continued complacently. "We know everything there is to know about you. Certainly everything that is a matter of public record." He gave her a tight little smile. "And we've come to the conclusion that only we can offer you the resources to allow your inventiveness full scope." "Who are you?" she almost shouted, all the time thinking, "Ah, so I was right. Tricker's gang." "My name is Poole," he said. "Just Poole," Clea demanded sarcastically, remembering Tricker's insistence on being called a simple, unadorned Tricker. "Yes," he agreed, with a slightly self-deprecatory smile. "Just Poole." Clea drew in a deep breath. "And who is we, Poole?" The smile broadened. "We are your tax dollars at work, Ms. Bennett." Setting her jaw, Clea tilted her head at a defiant angle. Actually, she was delighted. The government had to have taken over the Skynet project when Cyberdyne's second facility was destroyed. By the Connors again. But a human would object to this sort of treatment. "And if I don't want to work for the government?" she asked. Poole shrugged. "Then we would have to tell Vladimir Hill that the wonderful new material you've been letting him play with, as though it was clay, is one of the most carcinogenic materials ever devised." He paused as if to gauge her reaction. Clea gave him one. "Nonsense!" she snapped, sitting forward. Then she looked queasy and leaned back again. "What are you talking about?" "He'll probably be dead by next year," Poole said. "But that would allow him plenty of time to sue you. And of course there would probably be charges of criminal negligence. You'd probably do jail time." His eyes cooled. "In fact, you can count on that. And afterward, well, Cyberdyne wouldn't touch you or Intellimetal with a 10-foot pole, and neither would anyone else." He spread his hands. "Which would leave you with us. But not before we both lost a lot of time and effort and money. So why not just cooperate, and we'll all be happy." Clea allowed herself to look shaken. Her computer dropped her circulation slightly so that her face would go pale. "Does Vladimir have cancer?" Her eyes widened. "Do I?" she asked, her voice quavering. "We don't know, actually. Your tests aren't back. But the odds are good. As for Hill, in good conscience, of course, we can't let him remain at risk. We'll warn him quite soon, and if it's caught early enough, there's always a chance he might survive. You too, of course. But we think you'd be better off if you suddenly became unavailable. Don't you?" She nodded, looking shell-shocked, or so the mirror told her. He smiled, an avuncular smile this time. Poole seemed to have quite a repertoire. "Very wise," he murmured. "You won't regret it, I'm sure. Our terms won't be quite as generous as Cyberdyne's, but our facilities are the best, and our research budget is virtually unlimited." He stood, smiling down at her. "Why don't you lie back down and get some rest?" he advised. "That drug can pack quite a punch. Later on, someone will come and take you to your room, where you can have something to eat and relax. Then tomorrow we'll outfit you for your new job. And by the evening, you'll be on your way." "On my way where?" she asked, trying to sound crushed. Instead, her computer component was suppressing glee. This was turning out exactly as planned. And if it hadn't been, 67% probability of terminating all units here and escaping without irreparable damage. She calculated automatically. His lips jerked into a mirthless smile, and he turned to the door. "I'd rather not say," he told her. Then he walked out the door. She heard the click of a lock, and then his receding footsteps. Clea covered her mouth as though feeling sick, and leaned over, hanging her head. Then she lay down, and turning her back to the mirror, began to sob quietly for the benefit of whoever still lurked in the room behind the mirror. It was too late now to do anything about her missing uncle, she decided. Agents might still be loitering around asking questions, making it very risky to fill the empty hole. I'll just have to take a chance on it, she thought. But even if they do open the grave to find it empty, that proves nothing. At least nothing against her. Even so, it bothered her. It was very hard, she reflected, to know when to stop refining a plan. I should inform Alyssa of the latest developments. Craig Kipfer's office, Southern California. Alternate uses for IntelliMetal. Bullets. IntelliMetal, once fired, will expand with the heat of the explosion, mushrooming into the most effective shape possible. On striking the target, it will break apart into smaller pieces, each piece seeking the primary electrical source in the body, the brain. Once there, each individual piece of IntelliMetal will respond to the brain's electrical patterns by oscillating at a very fast rate as it seeks to rebond with the other pieces of IntelliMetal. This will effectively liquefy the brain. Mine worms. These anti-personnel devices will be planted like seeds in rows, while the farmer is protected by special gloves and boots, possibly special coveralls as well. When stepped on, the rods of IntelliMetal will activate and burrow upward through boots, flesh, and bone, again in search of the body's primary electrical source. As an additional advantage, when anyone subsequently touches the body, the activated mineworms will try to burrow into this subject as well. Craig Kipfer sat back, his lips pursed as though to whistle, but emitting no sound. There was some additional stuff in the girl's notes about possible security uses for her invention, but it was her ideas for weapons that both fascinated and chilled him. He'd been around long enough to know that women could outdo men in viciousness. Even so, he found it hard to associate these ideas with that young woman's lovely face. It proved once again the truth of an adage he'd been taught when he first started in this service. Beauty is a weapon. Feel free to use it. Never let it use you. From the moment he heard about that statue in New York, he'd been interested in Clea Bennett. And when she began throwing out ideas that paralleled the Skynet project during her meeting with Colvin and Warren, he knew that he wanted her to work for him. Else he'd never have ordered her picked up. But this. Talk about a bonus, he thought. Kipfer sat forward in his chair and pulled out his keyboard. He'd been of two minds about the woman. Keep or kill. Poole was waiting for his orders. Send her to Antarctica, he typed, then sent the message. After this, he'd hear about her in progress reports, or not at all. Until, that is, such time as he had to review his decision to let her live. Red Seal Base, Antarctica. They arrived at night, delivered by an Osprey tilt rotor, with no markings and no way to see out from the passenger compartment. Clear, and two rather groggy-looking men. Or perhaps they were just sullen. She decided to imitate their look and manner, adding a bit of frightened little girl to her demeanor. They were hustled through the freezing darkness to a building like a shed. Clear had the impression of a vast reflective whiteness as they rushed through the dark, as though the surface of the moon were under their feet. Once inside the shed, they were made to go down a flight of stairs into a small, unfurnished room. Two of the men from the plane were with them, silent, their eyes always moving among the three of them, as though they expected something to happen, both holding Ingram machine pistols. The room began to move, and Clear gasped. The men glanced at her apathetically, the guards sharply. She looked at them as though she wanted to say something, but then changed her mind. Serena had definitely had the easier part to play, she decided. All she'd had to do was portray a ruthlessly efficient human. Whereas Clear was trying to convey inexperience, naivete, brilliance, and humanity. She'd have to work at simplifying her portrayal as she went along. This was tedious. She didn't know a great deal about Antarctica, but she rather thought that digging this deeply into it was something forbidden. She did know that according to international treaty, it was supposed to be free of military influence. This installation would seem to put the lie to that pretty notion. It suddenly occurred to her that the more she interacted with humans, the more her thoughts became like Serena's. Either my brain is overcoming any damage done by my accelerated growth, or I'm doomed to fail, she thought sourly. Or both. She wanted to contact Alyssa, but hadn't because her captors might be able to detect such communication. Better to wait until she knew more. But she resented the break in contact. The elevator finally stopped, and they were led out into a corridor lined with doors that had numbers and message pockets on them. The floor tiles and the walls were beige, and the ceiling had acoustic tiles and fluorescent lights. They could be anywhere on Earth, rather than literally at the end of the Earth. The three of them were marched down the corridor until they came to a door like all the others. One of the guards knocked, then opened the door, motioning them inside. It looked like a small meeting room. A chalkboard and desk were placed at one end of the room, with several rows of chairs in front of them. A middle-aged man in good physical shape sat on the edge of the desk. He raised his head to look them over. Tricker, Clear thought, almost delighted to see him. It was like unexpectedly finding an old friend. Then, he'll recognize me, she thought. But he didn't seem to at the moment. He appeared bored, so much so that even though he was looking at them, he wasn't really seeing them. I suppose I can keep out of his way. Time would tell if he was going to be a problem. I'll think of it as a challenge, she decided. Somehow, he seemed to wear his tan chinos and plain grey flannel shirt as though they were a uniform. Casting a brief look at the guards, he nodded, and the two men went out, closing the door behind them. "Welcome to Red Seal Base," he said. "My name is Tricker. I'm the Chief of Security and I'll be your supervisor here. If you have any problems or needs that we aren't meeting, and I mean anything, come and see me." He looked them over as though trying to ascertain if they'd understood him. Then he continued. "You're probably tired, so I won't keep you tonight. Tomorrow morning at 0800 hours, I'll take you to the cafeteria and introduce you around. After breakfast, we'll take a brief tour of the base. It will be a brief tour, as you aren't allowed into most sectors. Then I'll show you to your own labs, and you can get settled. After dinner, we'll have another meeting, and you can tell me about anything you need that we haven't supplied yet." Tricker paused, assessing each of them with cool blue eyes. "It's important that you understand from the outset that you are not to discuss anyone's work with them or to discuss your own work with anyone else." Clea saw the two men beside her glance at each other. "Obviously," Tricker said, not even trying to hide his exasperation. "If you're working together, that doesn't apply as far as your own work goes. If you find this too confining, come and speak to me, and we'll see what we can do. Do not," he held up a warning finger, "simply decide to break this rule. You would regret that, I promise you." He looked at them. They looked at him. "Do you understand?" "Yes," they mumbled. "There are sandwiches and coffee in your rooms for tonight," Tricker told them. "But generally, you'll eat in the cafeteria with everyone else. We'll do our best to make you comfortable here, folks. How comfortable is up to you." Maybe he's asleep, the I-950 thought, surprised that he hadn't responded to her appearance. He certainly sounded it. "The people outside will escort you to your rooms," Tricker said, rising. "You'll receive a wake-up call at 0700. Be ready for me to pick you up an hour later. Good night." The two men and Clea looked at one another, then turned and toddled out the door, somewhat awkward in their heavy clothing. Outside, two men and a woman were waiting for them, smiling for all they were worth. "Welcome to Red Seal Base," they said cheerfully, and more or less in unison. "You must be Clea Bennett." The woman stepped forward, offering her hand. "I'm Josephine Lowe, your buddy." The I-950 just stared at her. This was almost unbelievably presumptuous, beyond anything she'd yet experienced from humans. "You know, like in swimming class or fire drill," Josephine continued. "We're in a dangerous place, you know, and so they feel we should all have someone looking out for us. That way, if we have to evacuate in a hurry, no one will get left behind. Unless," she chuckled, "both buddies are together, Lowe was plump and crammed into a belted grey jumpsuit with sneakers on her feet. She was about 45, with short blonde hair brushed back from her rather ordinary face. She wore no makeup. "I'm right next door to you," Josephine was saying. Somehow, Clea didn't find this reassuring in the least. She looked around and saw the two men going off with their buddies. "You look exhausted, you poor thing," Clea's buddy said. She lifted her arm as though she was going to put it around the I-950's shoulders, but didn't actually touch her. "Let me show you to your room. A little supper and a good night's sleep will do wonders for you." Ah, Clea thought. I look exhausted. That's why Tricker didn't recognize me. Well, she'd have to see what she could do to continue looking mousy and uninteresting. Meanwhile, she'd have to see what she could learn from this source. "Have you been here long?" she asked Josephine, smiling tentatively. "Oh, just ages, honey. At first, I thought I'd go stir crazy, but then I got to really like it here. We've got a pretty good mix of people. You'll see." A hopeful note. "Do you like bridge?" Clea followed her down the hallway, listening to her non-stop chatter and wondering if, in fact, poor Josephine had gone stir crazy and just didn't know it. The cafeteria was the single largest room on the base, Tricker told them, with the exception of the warehouse, naturally. Clea found it almost excessively institutional, with its rows of long, formica-topped tables on either side of a wide central aisle. There were the same beige floor tiles and walls, with the inevitable bulletin board for decoration. At the head of the room, one picked up a tray and utensils, and dragged it along to the place where food was dispensed. It was rather noisy, and smelled like a medium-priced chain restaurant. Applebee's, say. The ceiling lights mimicked natural daylight, as did most of the other lights on the base, or so Tricker had told them. It didn't surprise her that the humans needed to be indulged this way. They were animals, after all, and 6 months of night or day was not a natural part of their cycle. The people in the big room seemed to take a polite interest in the 3 new arrivals, watching them surreptitiously as they got their food and found seats. As Clea moved to join her fellow newcomers, she found herself greeted with friendly smiles and nods. The I-950 found them rather... what was the word? Creepy. She joined the conversation already in progress at the table Tricker had chosen. He glanced at her as she set down her tray and continued to watch her as she pretended not to notice. When she looked up, she smiled at him, then let her face drop as he continued to stare at her. "What?" she asked defensively. He spooned up some oatmeal before answering her. "You look familiar," he said. Clea looked at him askance. "Is that a line?" He swallowed the oatmeal and took a sip of coffee before he answered her, his gaze never wavering. "No, I've met you. I'm sure of it." Shaking her head, Clea told him, I don't think so, Mr. Tricker. Just Tricker, he said. Uh-huh. Well, Tricker, she said, leaning forward. Have you ever been to Montana? He shook his head, spooning up more oatmeal. Well, except for one trip to New York and one trip to LA, both in the last month, I've never been anywhere else. So I don't know how you could have met me. Do you? She widened her eyes at him and took a sip of coffee. The two men who'd arrived with her turned their heads back and forth between them. Is this important? One of them asked, tentatively. Clea thought that the fact he asked at all hinted at a habitual arrogance that circumstances had temporarily muted. No, Tricker answered. Not at all. With a last indecipherable look at Clea, he returned to his lecture about the base's rules. Ah, I see we have some new prisoners, Tricker. The man's voice had a thick German accent and came from behind the I-950. South German. Her computer half supplied helpfully. Within 50 kilometers of Vienna, but not actually in Vienna. Originally middle class. She turned to look and found a tall, muscular blonde man staring down at them. Kurt Viemeister, she thought, and her heart leapt, like a human girl meeting her favorite musician. Serena had decided that Viemeister was insane because of his extreme hatred for certain classes of human being, and had stopped associating with him. But Clea had always felt that her parent sister was wrong. If this scientist hated humans, well, so did Skynet, and so did the Infiltrators, for that matter. Of course, they hated all humans and wanted to exterminate them. But why was that reason to judge Dr. Viemeister for only hating some? Though she was painfully aware that Serena entertained almost fond feelings for humans. Subversive, misguided, and a failure. Clea thought dismissively. She intended to encourage Viemeister's efforts for Skynet. It didn't matter if he hated humans, but making Skynet sentient did. Viemeister put his tray down beside Clea, giving her a pleasant smile. Aren't you going to introduce us? Tricker took a sip of coffee and looked thoughtfully into the distance, while the three newcomers watched him. Viemeister buttered his toast and salted his omelette as though he'd never said a word. Clea rolled her eyes and gave a crisp then turned to Viemeister. I'm Clea Bennett, she said, offering her hand. From Montana. Charmed, he said, taking her hand gently and giving her a warm smile. He looked at the two men opposite them. Joel Gibson, a heavy-set, middle-aged man, said. Maxwell Massey, his friend said. Maxwell had the dark looks of an East Indian. So what have they got on you folks? Kurt said cheerfully. Clea blinked as she realized his accent was much less thick than it had been. Serena had always suspected that he affected it. What he'd said was as interesting as how he'd said it, too. She glanced at the two men. "See, now this is where you have to watch out," Tricker interrupted. "If any of you answer that question, you may find yourselves segueing into a conversation about your work." Now, what did I say about discussing your work? "But I already know something about Mr. Viemeister's specialty," Clea said eagerly. She turned to the scientist. "My uncle was a great admirer of yours, and I've read all of your published work." Obviously, gushing was the right tack to take with him. He fairly glowed in her infrared vision. "Your ideas on—" "Hey!" Tricker interrupted. He pointed his spoon at her. "That's something that you and I will have to discuss in private." "Do you know why?" He drew out the last word. Clea rolled her eyes again. "Because otherwise we'll be discussing Mr. Viemeister's work, and we're not supposed to discuss one another's work." She raised her brows at him. "Did I get it right, teacher?" "Yup," he said. Tricker scraped his bowl and ate the last spoonful. "If you're granted permission to talk about your work to one another, you can yak about it all you want in private." He rotated his spoon, indicating the room around them. "Never in here. In here, none of us have jobs. Comprende?" "Yeah," she said, letting a little insolence seep into her voice. Beside her, Viemeister seemed amused. "Great. If you folks are ready, we should get started. I know you all have a lot to do today." Tricker rose and looked at them expectantly. "I haven't finished my coffee," the I-950 hazarded. "Well, too bad. Chop chop, Miss Bennett." He gave Viemeister an artificial smile. "Nice seeing you, Kurt." Then he turned on his heel and walked away. Gibson and Massey scrambled to follow him, but Clea lingered, taking a last sip of her coffee. Then she gave Viemeister a conspiratorial smile, rose, folded her napkin, and slowly sauntered after the men. Her walk gave the scientist something to watch, if he was so inclined. Kurt watched the young woman walk away. It looked as though the long, dry spell was about to end, and to end very pleasantly indeed. As the girl followed Tricker and his chumps out the door, she glanced at him over her shoulder and gave him a delightful little smile. If only she were a blonde, she'd be a perfect Aryan. Yes, definitely. Things were looking up.